My name is Mariana Cervantes, and my presentation is on multicultural considerations to conducting ethical research. Here's a quick outline of the presentation. We're going to be talking about why this is important to counseling, how conducting research tends to be applying Western models to non-Western cultures, the best practices for recruiting participants, going over informed consent, collecting data, analyzing the data, and then just overall tying up with considerations for researching multicultural and diverse groups and their implications in counseling. So first off, why is this important? In the ACA Code of Ethics, it's to Section G, it talks about research for counseling, and it goes on to mention how counselors must minimize biases and respect the diversity, especially in implementing this research. Other than that mention right there in that section, there is not another mention of multiculturalness or diversity in conducting research and counseling. There are a few mentions of different cultures and diversity throughout the Code of Ethics, but not so much in research. And I think that kind of emphasizes why it's important to do multicultural research and how that is going to help you best serve your clients. So applying Western models to non-Western groups, oftentimes in research, we tend to formulate questions and research topics and things based on our own ideas, the typical Western model. And a lot of times what we don't realize is that the formation of these research questions often give hints to what the researcher values or is important to them. Just for example, me deciding to do this presentation on multicultural research and counseling kind of gives away some things that I find valuable or things that I hold, important to me. And so that's something to be aware of when you're designing your research studies and things. Azebo 1988 talked about how oftentimes when we go to research different populations, it's comparative research. And we are looking at this research based on comparing whatever population we're looking at to a control group. And they went on to say that that would be like the white European control group, and we're trying to see how this idea applies to a different group of people of a different ethnicity, a different race. And so that's something to be aware of as well, because it makes it seem like this other group is not a separate entity on their own, or that they're not worthy of being recognized as their own. They must be compared to a more European style. Another thing to consider when working with different cultures and different groups of people in research is what are your motivations, or what are the researchers' motivations? Are you trying to prove something negative? Are you trying to enlighten people about a different group? Just another thing to be considered about. And Christaki 1992 conducted a study and found 4 different ways that we can apply these ethical models for research, applying these Western models to non-Western models. One of them is relying solely on the Western model, which might not be good, as we already discussed. Another one is relying solely on the non-Western model, which can get a little confusing because we might not know their practices and beliefs. Another one is a little bit of mostly Western with a little bit of non-Western model, and for previously mentioned reasons, that also might not be the most ethical or valuable and equivalent way to research. And then lastly, it would be a 50-50 split between the Western and the non-Western groups. But the difficulty there is translation of topics. One topic or value might not be the same in another culture, and that's something to be considerate about as well. So just some of these things that we have to think about when working with multicultural groups and to keep in mind. So another big part about this and working with different groups and conducting research is the way that we recruit these participants. You must, a good way to be able to reach these participants are to have background research about their values, their belief systems, what are their communities like, and this would be the best way to recruit these participants, taking consideration the population that you're targeting. For example, if you're wanting to do research on documented immigrants, it might not be the best idea to reach out to recruit participants through newspapers or radio ads or things like that, because they seem institutionalized, and somebody from this population might not be as open to receiving that. Another thing to consider is that non-Western groups tend to be more community-based. So when recruiting these participants, again, dependent on different what culture, what population you're wanting to work with, it might be best to recruit these people face-to-face, a one-on-one basis. And with that, you might need to consider being acquainted with the community gatekeeper. For example, somebody in the community that is well respected, that is trusted, reaching out to this person first or this organization, creating that trust, that relationship there, and then allowing them to help you further recruit participants from that selected population. And then Eggers and Flynn, 2010, kind of discussed the positives and negatives of having these close-knit communities. One of them is that it's easier for recruitment. Definitely, if you have one person knows you and trusts you, you're able to bring in your other groups, your other people, and collect participants that way. But a potential negative effect of this is that because these groups of people are so closely knit, we might have to worry about sharing of information and things like that, especially if we recruit these gatekeeper organizations to help us with recruiting participants and maybe even collecting data, which I'll get to in a second. Informed consent is another big thing, especially with working with these different types of populations. And the given population is the only people who can consider seriously what the deleterious effects are of their participation. Harding et al. Conducted research with tribal groups, and they had suggested that it's important to bring in these communities and have them a part of the study from the ground up, helping in the process of designing the study, or how you're going to recruit or collect data, or how the data is going to be shared, because they're the ones who know how their systems work, what their institutions are like, what their beliefs are, and how you as a researcher is going to fit into that and best be supported by the community. Another thing with informed consent is the language that is used. I was looking through the Code of Ethics again, and in section G, 2A, it talks about how informed consent, counselors use language of informed consent to offer answers to inquiries or attend discomforts, risks, and potential power differentiations. That right there is a mouthful. Looking at that language right there, that could definitely be simplified, offers to answer questions, or informs the participant of possible dangers or benefits. And so it's important to keep that plain language when working with some of these different populations, especially if some of these concepts don't exactly translate into possibly another language if they are a different language group. And then another thing Allen and Walsh found is that some populations, some cultures, don't like emphasis too much on risks because it stresses out the participants. Again, something that you'd be aware of as you've done research on your population and you know how best to target them and things. All right, so collecting data. Again, if we're working with different populations, maybe a bilingual population, it's important to make sure that all of the materials and assessments and things are translated accurately. A big thing with this is the difference between the formality and informality of languages, because, for example, Spanish that you learn in a classroom setting is going to be very different than, the Spanish that a family member might be speaking to other family members. So just something to be aware of. And again, this is mentioned in the Code of Ethics about using caution with assessments that are normed for populations that aren't specific to the population that you're working with. Again, with incorporating that Western ideals to non-Western groups, something to be cognizant of, recognize the effects of culture, ethnic group, language preference on the tests or assessments that you're choosing to use with your given population. And again, with this and with the whole translation and everything, a good way to make sure that your tests are valid is possibly Peterson, and Powell suggest doing cognitive interviewing. And this is a way just to double check, make sure that your tests were translated appropriately, that the concepts hold up in one language, and what you were looking for to make sure that your data is actually being collected and you're getting the answers that you were looking for versus something else. And another thing, too, to consider when collecting data is to consider the education level of the group that you're working with. Some of these populations might they all might have gone through school and have a reading level, and some might not be able to read. And so with this, you might need to weigh the cost and benefit of administering these assessments verbally or with a hard copy. And this is where those relationships you build with the gatekeepers or the community members can be important, because you might need to incorporate them in helping you to collect and translate this data, especially giving the verbal administrations of this assessments. And then with that becomes another ethical issue. And in the research that I found, they suggested having the community member who is collecting this data also do the same training that the researchers would be doing to make sure they understand the importance of keeping confidentiality. Data analysis is another thing, another process to be aware of. Another point in the process to be aware of the culture and group of people that you're working with. And in the Code of Ethics, G4A describes the extent to which the results are applicable for these diverse populations. And this is important because Egerth and Flynn, 2010, found some implications for how you analyze this data and present it to the public. And some things just to be considerate of are the political implications that the data might have to the population or the group that you're working with. It can open creating these, and that's where creating these relationships with this community that you're looking into is very important, because it opens understandings for new materials. You might be able to establish new friendships with this community, even if you wanted to conduct further research in the future. And it also sensitizes researchers to maybe problems or insights or things that they weren't able to see themselves, but having that community perspective, somebody from that population help you and see how actually your data might be applicable or important to their population. And also this partnership helps you to be honest and when you're reporting your findings, and again, try to stay away from being biased in your reports. Overall, these are just some considerations for research and counseling, just some things to be cognizant of as you're deciding to work with these different populations and diverse groups of people. I would say that building trusting relationships are essential. They not only allow you to get the participants and things that you need, but they help to understand, create a sense of understanding between you and the community that you're working with, that the sense of importance for this research and for how it could be beneficial to this population. Cultural variables of the group that you're trying to work with should be kept in mind throughout the entire researching process. We talked about developing the question, your research question, what you're looking at. We talked about recruiting participants, informed consent. These are things that just to keep in mind, and you would have known this by doing the research, the background research on the population you're trying to study. Study samples should also be properly described so that they're not overgeneralized. I know we took the diverse populations class, and in there we learned different things about different groups of people and things like that. So it's just important to be aware of that, not everybody from that same group is going to act the same or respond the same to the questions and things that you're asking them. And also be sensitive to the values of the populations you plan to work with, and understand as an outsider, as a researcher, what your role may look like to those people as you're interacting with them, and how that might affect them or the way that the data and things of the research that you're collecting. And then always, of course, just consider the cultural consequences of the research. We talked about publishing and political implications and things, and especially in the political climate of today. Just another thing to be aware of as you conduct this research and decide to publish it to a group. So these are my references, and thank you for watching my presentation.